Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. This is a real honor, and I haven't spoken about this stuff in a while, so this should be fun for me. I'm glad that this year this got to happen, and thanks for inviting me twice. So yeah. With that said, I'm going to say some very provocative things, and hopefully I run out of time so that there's no opportunity for questions. Um, sort of kidding about that. But yeah, my idea is to say some provocative things, and then yeah, we'll see where that goes. Okay, so let me see if I can manipulate this. Yes. Okay, so some things that I'm going to say about selection theory. Selection theory is a label that I'm just going to use for the theory you learned from population genetics textbooks. Uh, it's a general scientific theory that's applicable to diverse natural systems and is used to make explanatory inferences about the dynamics of those systems. You could compare it to theories in, like something like classical physics or things with narrower applications like, theories in fluid dynamics or what have you. It's just a general theory that applies to some systems and you explain how they behave using the theory. Selection theory is indefinite. That is, you can't really circumscribe it. You can't say what are the systems it applies to. So it's circumscribed, like I say, if at all, in an unprincipled manner. In particular, you might think selection theory was a theory of evolution, but it's not. Really, it's just causal modeling. Selection theory or population genetics is really just applied causal modeling. There's no really special method for it. Particular to the sorts of systems it's used for. There's no really rigorously delineated set of systems to which it applies. It's an indefinite causal modeling theory. It's actually applicable to natural systems, things in nature, only here and there, largely because of the epistemic limitations we face when we try to apply it. There's relatively few cases of applied selection theory. You tend to see it applied to explain polymorphisms, and that's because polymorphisms stick around. So if you have one or another kind of sustained polymorphism, such as a stable polymorphism or a protected polymorphism, the theory really works well when you apply it to those systems because, you can do the research. Systems that evolve directionally tend to evolve directionally to fixation, and unless you happen to catch them in the act, it's hard to, just for epistemic reason, to apply it to those sorts of systems. So relatively few applications, and the ones to which it's applied may not always be the most important. That's really dictated by convenience more than anything. If it's appropriate to say selection theory is true or it's credible or to give it some sort of credence rating or confidence rating, then its credibility is not derived from evidence. We don't find any evidence for selection theory. If you look in population genetics textbooks, they'll tell you how to apply models and how to deploy them and how to solve equations, but they won't give you any evidence for them. And that's not weird if it's a kind of causal modeling, because that's how causal modeling is. Okay. Oh no, I can't use the buttons. Hold on. There we go. Something I'm going to say about natural selection. The most important thing to say about natural selection is that it's a label. That is, it's not a tool for understanding. I think it's actually really a bunch of labels. So it's used to label different things. Drift is similar, although I won't even try to make the case about drift. Labels aren't ever all that good. They're not all that great things to have. You don't advance understanding. You don't increase expressive capacity by labeling. Labeling is at best a convenience. Some labels, particularly labels with multiple meanings, semantic labels, are bad. Probably most importantly for our purposes, they're not suitable targets for philosophical inquiry. Okay. Sorry. Some implications of what I've said. Many areas of philosophical investigation, I think, in philosophy of biology are blind alleys. Arguments over the scope of selection theory and what sort of systems it applies to, I think it's a blind alley. And arguments over the interpretation of natural selection or drift equally are blind alleys. The quantities in causal models, anyhow, that quantify or are said to quantify selection, wear their interpretations on their sleeves. So if you understand how to do the causal models, how to put together a causal model for a system, you know what the quantities labeled natural selection mean. I'll give you an example later, but that you don't have to call them selection or anything. Various notions like group selection or kin selection and such are best viewed in alignment with other notions that you find in population genetics textbooks like variable selection, multi-locus selection, multi-allelic selection, sex-dependent selection. These are all just labels. They are labels for mathematical techniques for particular types of systems. So you wouldn't want to do a philosophical inquiry into sex-dependent selection because all sex-dependent selection is a label for some math that you learn in a section of a textbook. Okay. All right, so I want to confront something that may have been you may have been thinking in the back of your head. Isn't this just a gift of creationists? Look what I've just said. I said, selection theory is indefinite. It's not a genuine theory, really. It's just an application of causal modeling. It has limited application to natural systems. It gains no credibility from evidence, and natural selection is not a tool for understanding. It's seemingly a gift of creationists. Okay, so I'm going to parry that concern by saying, well, making a distinction, right? This is how you have your cake and eat it too. And look, what I've been saying, what I've been discussing is something I called selection theory. Remember, it's just, the theory you learn if you learn population genetics. And this is different from what I'm going to call the theory of evolution by natural selection. A totally different theory. Well, they're related, I suppose. Totally different is a bit strong, but an entirely different theory. And really what's opposed to creationism in the origin is the theory of evolution by natural selection, not selection theory. The theory of evolution by natural selection is not a general scientific theory applicable to diverse natural systems and used to make explanatory inferences about the dynamics of those systems. It is not like selection theory. It is not like theories in fluid dynamics. It's not like, rational mechanics. It's not like, theories you find in the history of science that have this feature. Instead, it's a theory of a single protracted event, the origin of species and adaptations. Now, that's a protracted and multi-dimensional event, right? But it's a theory of why the history of the Earth is the way it is. And that's what's opposed to creationism, not selection. All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about the theory of evolution by natural selection. I'm just going to call it TENS. All right, here. Okay, so the features it has. It is a definite rather than indefinite theory. It's identifiable. It's historically novel. Darwin is the main figure who develops it. It's well supported by evidence. So its credibility is a function of evidence, and it has high credibility because it has a lot of evidence. It's just like a theory of a crime presented at a trial. It's an explanation of a particular sort of event. It defeats its creationist rival in a fair contest. So if you imagine there being a kind of trial between creationism and TENS, TENS should win. And it has a history of improvement. It gets refined, revised, supplemented in a bunch of ways historically. Okay, so I have my two theories, right? The first theory is essentially population genetics. It's kind of like a theory in fluid mechanics or a theory in, classical physics or something like that. And then there is the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is kind of like a theory of a crime, where the crime is the Earth is as it is, right? The history of life on Earth is as it is. Okay, so both of these are found in Darwin's Origin of Species. Darwin and Wallace are the first people to put together models in selection theory. They're qualitative models, not quantitative ones. They're laid out initially in chapter 4 of the Origin, and we'll look at one in a second, though I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's the wolf one. And later writers made selection theory into a quantitative theory. So this is the big advances used to, credited to Fisher, Haldane, and Wright. Lots of people in their wake. The bulk of the Origin is devoted to the theory of evolution by natural selection, not selection theory. Selection theory is an important element of that work, but it is not the whole of it. Okay, so there's plenty of evidence in favor of TENS and challenges for the rival creationist position. I ran this analogy with a crime. I don't know if it was that useful, but here we go. So at a trial, prosecution and defense attorneys' explanatory targets, what they're trying to explain, are drawn from a set of descriptive claims, which is the evidence presented at the trial. and the prosecution and the defense theories consist in descriptive claims that are not part of that evidence, right? And it's always the case the prosecutor is going to have as part of their theory that the defendant committed the crime, and it's always going to be the case that the defense theory is going to contain some or another claim, maybe multiple ones, which are inconsistent with the defendant having committed the crime, right? Exonerating elements. Both aim to have their theories accepted. That is, they both aim to have them be part of our institutional commitments, so the commitments of our legal system. And the credibility of each theory is a function of its explanatory power. So if the defense theory has better explanatory power, it should win. And if the prosecution theory has better explanatory power, it should win. And the competition between the theory of evolution by natural selection and creationism is like this too. So both Darwin and creationists aim to place their theories within the set of our, institutional commitments, scientific consensus. The evidences are the descriptive claims about the universe that have to be conceded by both sides. And the proponents of each position allege that the evidence, or at least elements of it, can be inferred in an explanatory sort of way from their theory. The competition for explanatory success is won by touting, your own virtues, your own explanatory successes, and alleging explanatory failures to your competitors. And your relative success at this is the source of your credibility for your theory. And the credibility contest should determine our institutionally accepted descriptive beliefs over and above the evidence, which we already have to accept. Okay. So here's just a smidge of the sort of evidence that Darwin puts forward in The Origin in favor of the theory of evolution by natural selection. You have the law of succession of types that, extinct species found as fossils in any region are often similar enough to extinct species living there as belonging to the same genera or families. You have this biogeographical evidence that, Galapagos land birds resemble mainland species despite different environments. You have the evidence from embryology. This should all be familiar. This is all stuff that Darwin's theory can explain that creationism cannot. Okay, so what's the relationship between the theory of evolution by natural selection and selection theory? Well, here we go. The theory of evolution by natural selection is the kind of explanatory theory that aims to explain an event, right? The history of adaptation and speciation of life on Earth, right? And which gains credibility from its explanatory relationships to the evidence. Selection theory, by contrast, remember, it's a loosely circumscribed general scientific theory which by which the dynamics of natural systems are inferred in an explanatory sort of way by means of mathematical models. Darwin pioneered the use of selection theory using a non-mathematical qualitative version in The Origin. He applied it to imaginary scenarios. And selection theory is just one component of the Origin. So here is, everyone's read this Wolf passage a million times, I'm sure, so maybe I'll skip it. But what's important about it is Darwin is showing how you can apply selection theory to a natural population by doing so for just an imaginary population that he's thinking up with wolves with different length of legs. There are other cases after that, of course, in chapter 4. Okay. What does selection theory do for Darwin in his case for the theory of evolution by natural selection? Well, it shows how the origin of species and adaptations could be explained or explicable as a result of evolutionary change. In a very interesting paper James Lennox has in 1991, he makes the case that that's what Darwin is doing. He's showing the explanatory power of his theory, showing how it could explain events, not explaining them. After all, an imaginary scenario is not an explanation. While the theory that evolution explains the origin of species is defended on the basis of evidence, selection theory plays a kind of subsidiary role in the theory of evolution by natural selection. It just provides an account of how adaptive evolutionary change could occur. Not how it actually did, but just how it could. So we should believe that evolution by natural selection explains the origin of species and adaptations for that matter, because it could do so, and that is actually what is supplied by selection theory in the origin, and that there's lots of evidence that it did do so, which is really what the rest of the origin is dedicated to showing. All right, so if you look at the history of selection theory, what you'll see is that it evolves. It's made quantitative by population geneticists and quantitative geneticists and other people using other modeling approaches. You see an expansion of it, of what it, the sorts of things it can explain. So initially it's used to explain evolution, and Darwin himself used it to explain the persistence of polymorphisms. But since then you get explanations of cyclical behavior, stable polymorphisms, random dynamics, partially random dynamics. I mentioned protected polymorphisms earlier. There's a bunch of stuff you can explain the selection to. You see this history of development where the early models are quite simple. They're developed prior to computer simulation, and they contain a great many assumptions that limit their applicability to natural systems, but as a result are analytically tractable, right? So you can actually solve the equations that they generate. Then they're used to make explanatory inferences about natural systems into the, or about systems anyway, into the indefinite future. After that, you see what I call complexification. The assumptions that are built into the early models are denied bit by bit, piecemeal, right? So you can replace discrete generations with age structures. You can replace environmental homogeneity with various kinds of variable selection. You can replace unitary populations with ones featuring substructures or subgroups. You can consider multi-allelic systems, systems with mutations, segregation distortion, multi-locus systems, sex-linked genes, frequency dependence. I mean, there's just, open a population genetics textbook, and there's this just diversity of, different types of models. Right? Often the mathematical techniques for quantifying the various novel causal influences like frequency dependent selection or multiple alleles or segregation distortion. Those can be used sort of, they're like modules. They can be used in all but unchanged across other variations. So you kind of get a Mr. Potato Head type structure, right? You can put together piecemeal stuff. Okay. All right, so probably this is where I get into my stance on selection. Look, in a population genetics textbook, lots of things are called selection, right? Like basically the various mathematical techniques that you use in order to make more complex these basic models, right? That is when you deny the assumption of discrete generations, or you deny the assumption that you're only going to consider alleles at a single locus, or you deny environmental homogeneity or whatever, right? All those things are called kinds of selection. But the critical point is that calling those things selection is just a convenience. You need labels for math, right? They're just labels, right? If you want to know what variable selection is, you have to understand the causal model. And if you understand the causal model, you understand everything. You don't have to then go into some theory of what the selection is, right? The selection is just being used as a label for the model. So here's an example of complexification. So a very early model in the history of population genetics is the genotypic selection model. I'm sure you guys have seen it a million times, but there you go. Right, and the interesting feature is that the environment, or the interesting feature for us today, is that the environment is homogeneous. That is, there are no causal influences that interact with the genotype under consideration. Right, so it's effectively homogeneous. And then later on, this is complexified. And how is it complexified? Well, one of the ways it's complexified is you deny the homogeneity of the environment and you introduce interactive environmental causes, ones that interact with the genotype under consideration. And when you do that, you get what's called a variable selection model. And here it is, right? And this is a very simple variable selection model. Right? No, wait. Oh, no. Okay, so no, sorry, I haven't gotten that far. So I'm getting ahead of myself. This is still the slide where we're talking about the genotypic selection. So notice, right, the quantity, right, so the W's here, right? So one thing that philosophers will say is that the W's quantify selection, right? And I really want to discourage this. What those W's quantify is the, they're just coefficients, and they quantify the extent of influence on the genotypes of genotypes on next generation allele frequency, right? They just quantify a causal influence, right? They're coefficients, right? They do so given the environment within which the genotypes interact, right? In this case, it's a homogeneous environment. Equally, you could say that the W's quantify the extent of influence on next generation allele frequencies of a degeneratively distributed homogeneous environmental cause that interacts with zygote genotypes. That's the other thing you could say. They actually effectively, those things are, to say each of those things is to say the same thing, right? But that's what you should say about the W's. You have to understand the W's coefficients in either of those two ways, which are effectively equivalent, to understand the mathematical model. You don't need to call them selection. It's not helpful to do so. There's no interpretation to be made of the W's that is, somehow up in the air and worthy of philosophical inquiry. They're coefficients. That's what they are. Okay, some more complexification, right? So here's the model I started talking about in a second, right? The homogeneous or non-degeneratively distributed heterogeneous, non-degeneratively distributed interactive environmental causes, right? If you want to talk about an environment where there's an environmental cause that interacts with the genotypes, you need new models, right? Because the old one assumes that's not the case. So you either have one with substructures. There's a famous island mainland model here. There's some banded snakes, I think, in Lake Erie that fit this pretty well. And then there's also subgroups. So you don't have substructures, but you have subgroups. There's an alternative way of handling environmental heterogeneity. And there you get the Levine model. That's from 1953, the first variable selection model. Here it is. As you can see, it's a bit more complicated, right? But all you've done is you've divided the environment into multiple sub-environments, and you've assigned separate coefficients to each genotype in that sub-environment. But again, we're going to, it's just the genotypic selection model, right, with one complexification. You add one interactive environmental cause, and this is what you get. Won't go into details there. You can even go crazier. You can even complexify even more. Leyland, Smith, and Feldman put forward a model with an environmental cause that itself evolves. So it's itself governed by its own recursive equation, the equation for R there, which again is a huge complexification. You get much crazier math in this case. Here you have an environmental variable that interacts with genotypes, but it has its own dynamics, right? In the Levine model, if you want to look at it, the frequencies of the various environmental causes are just fixed by the C's. But I don't even have the whole model. I just have the model for R. You can go look it up. It's pretty nutsy. But here the environment is itself changing over time as a function of the evolution of the system. So that's a real complexification. Okay, why do I bring this up? Look, selection theory, again, we're talking about that general scientific theory that's kind of like theories in fluid dynamics or classical mechanics or some theory of some types of systems, right? It has no principal boundary around the class of its models or modeling techniques. In fact, novelties like the Leyland-Feldman-Smee model are valuable, right? If you can generate new expansions, complexifications of models, that's good. And that means you're applying your theory to new systems. Contemporary selection theory is a theory of evolution, even of non-biological phenomena, as we saw with the case of niche construction there, with the R variable being a function of population evolution. There's no point. Don't bother searching the conditions of application of this theory when the idea is to state tidily the scope of the application of scientific theory. Breaking the boundaries of selection theory constitutes an advance. We can speak of a single entity selection theory only as a sort of historic artifact, right? It's a collection of modeling techniques. It was initially applied to make the origin of species and adaptations applicable, but it was generalized in all sorts of ways since then in an unprincipled fashion. Okay. So more and more models. So you may remember these from earlier. It's indefinite. Selection theory is indefinite. It expands through complexification and a process without natural limits. No point in trying to state the conditions for the application of this theory. It's not its own theory, really. It's just an application of application of causal modeling to natural systems with genetic variations or whatever, It has limited application to natural systems. We talked about that just for epistemic reasons. It's certainly not the case that we model all the natural systems on the planet or something with selection theory, and that's why we believe the theory of evolution by natural selection. That's not at all true. It's not the sort of thing that gains credibility from evidence. It's not the right sort of thing for that. Natural selection operates as just a label in population genetics textbooks for mathematical techniques or mathematical quantities. It's not an important notion in selection theory. And much of the sort of thing I've been saying here would go for other modeling approaches like the price equations. That's all right. It's just a statistical function that's labeled selection, right, in the price equation. And that's it. Yeah. So I'm done. Thank you for listening to me rant.